Joseph Justus Scaliger, or Scaliger, August 5th, 1540 to January 21st, 1609, was a French religious leader and scholar known for expanding the notion of classical history from Greek and ancient Roman history to include Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, and ancient Egyptian history. He spent the last 16 years of his life in the Netherlands. Scaliger was born at Agen, the 10th child, third son of Italian scholar Julius Caesar Scaliger.
And yet, Dr. Rogue Slowjack.
When he was 12 years old, he was sent with two younger brothers to the College of Guinea at Bordeaux, which was then under the direction of Jean Gelida. An outbreak of the plague in 1555 caused the boys to return home. And for the next few years, Joseph was his father's constant companion and amanuensis. The composition of Latin verse was the chief amusement of his father Julius in his later years, and he would daily dictate to his son between 80 and 100 lines, sometimes even more. Joseph was also required each day to write a Latin theme or declamation, though in other respects he seems to have been left to his own devices. He learned from his father to be not only a scholar, but also an acute observer, aiming at historical criticism more than at correcting texts. University and travels. After his father's death, he spent 4 years at the University of Paris, where he began the study of Greek under Adrianus Turnebus. But after 2 months, he found he was not in a position to profit from the lectures of the greatest Greek scholar of the time. He read Homer in 21 days, and then went through all other Greek poets, orators, and historians, forming a grammar for himself as he went along, don't we all? From Greek, at the suggestion of Guillaume Postel, he proceeded to attack Hebrew and then Arabic. Of both, he acquired a respectable knowledge. His most important teacher was Jean Durat. He was able to not only impart knowledge, but also kindle enthusiasm in Scaliger. It was to Durat that Scaliger owed his home for the next 30 years of his life. For in 1563, the professor recommended him to Louis de Cassinger, the young lord of La Roche-Posay, as a companion in his travels. A close friendship sprang up between the two young men, which remained unbroken till the death of Louis in 1595. The travelers first went to Rome. Here they found Marc-Antoine Muret, who, when at Bordeaux and Toulouse, had been a great favorite and occasional visitor of Julius Caesar Scaliger at Agen. Muret soon recognized the young Scaliger's merits and introduced him to many contacts well worth knowing. After visiting a large party in Italy, the travelers moved on to England and Scotland, passing, as it would seem, La Roche-Posay on their way. Scaliger formed an unfavorable opinion of the English. Their inhumane disposition and inhospitable treatment of foreigners especially made a negative impression on him. He was also disappointed in finding only a few Greek manuscripts and a few learned men. It was not until a much later period that he became intimate with Richard Thomson and other Englishmen. In the course of his travels, he had become a Protestant. France, Geneva, and France. On his return to France, he spent 3 years with the Chastainers, accompanying them to their different chateaux in Poitou, as the calls of the Civil War required. In 1570, he accepted the invitation of Jacques Cujas and proceeded to Valence to study jurisprudence under the greatest living jurist. Here he remained 3 years, profiting not only by the lectures, but even more by the library of Cujas, which filled no fewer than 7 or 8 rooms and included 500 manuscripts. The massacre of St. Bartholomew, occurring as he was about to accompany the Bishop of Valence to an embassy to Poland, made Scaliger flee, together with other Huguenots, for Geneva, where he was appointed a professor in the academy. He lectured on the Organon of Aristotle and the De Finibus of Cicero. to much satisfaction for the students, but not appreciating it himself. He hated lecturing and was bored. Academic output. It was during this period of his life that he composed and published his books of historical criticism. His editions of the Catalecta, 1575, of Festus, 1575, Catullus, Tibelius, and Propertius, 1577, are the work of a man determined to discover the real meaning and force of his author. He was the first to lay down and apply sound rules of criticism and emendation, and to change textual criticism from a series of haphazard guesses into rational procedures subject to fixed laws. Mark Pattison. But these works, while proving Scaliger's right to the foremost place among his contemporaries as Latin scholar and critic, did not go beyond mere scholarship. It was reserved for his edition of Manilius, 1579, and his De Emendatio Temporum, 1583, to revolutionize perceived ideas of ancient chronology, to show that ancient history is not confined to that of the Greeks and Romans, but also comprises that of the Persians, Babylonians, and Egyptians, hitherto neglected, and that of the Jews, hitherto treated as a thing apart, and that the historical narratives and fragments of each of these, and their several systems of chronology, must be critically compared. It was this innovation that distinguished Scaliger from contemporary scholars. Neither they nor those who immediately followed seemed to have appreciated his innovation. Instead, they valued his elementary criticism and his skill in Greek. His commentary on Manilius is really a treatise on ancient astronomy. It forms an introduction of the De Emendatio Temporum. In this work, Scaliger investigates ancient systems of determining epochs, calendars, and computations of time. Applying the work of Nicholas Copernicus and other modern scientists, he reveals the principles behind these systems. In the remaining 24 years of his life, he expanded on his work in the De Emendatio. He succeeded in reconstructing the lost chronicles of Vesuvius, one of the most valuable ancient documents, especially valuable for ancient chronology. This he printed in 1606 in his Thesaurus Temporum of Sibi Pamphili, in which he collected, restored, and arranged every chronological relic extant in Greek or Latin. The Netherlands. When in 1590 Justus Lipsius retired from the University of Leiden, the university and its protectors, the States General of the Netherlands and the Prince of Orange, resolved to appoint Scaliger his successor. He declined. He hated lecturing, and there were those among his friends who erroneously believed the success of Henry IV, learning would flourish, and Protestantism would be no barrier to his advancement. The invitation was renewed in the most flattering manner a year later. The invitation stated Scaliger would not be required to lecture, and that the university wished only for his presence, while he would be able to dispose of his own time in all respects. This offer Scaliger accepted provisionally. Midway through 1593, he set out for the Netherlands, where he would pass the remaining 16 years of his life, never returning to France. His reception at Leiden was all that he could have wished for. He received handsome income. He was treated with the highest consideration. His supposed rank as a prince of Verona, a sensitive issue for Scaliger, Scaligeri, was recognized that he could have wished for. Leiden, lying between The Hague and Amsterdam, Scaliger was able to enjoy, besides the learned circle of Leiden, the advantages of the best society of both these capitals. For Scaliger was no hermit buried among his books. He was fond of social intercourse and was himself a good talker. During the first 7 years of his residence at Leiden, his reputation... Is it Leiden or Leiden?
Leiden.
His reputation was at its highest point. His literary judgment was unquestioned. From his throne at Leiden, he ruled the learned world. A word from him could make or mar a rising reputation, and he was surrounded by young men eager to listen to and profit from his conversation. He encouraged Grotius, when only a youth of 16, to edit Capella. At the early death of the younger Duza, he wept as at that of a beloved son. Daniel Heinsius, at first his favorite pupil, became his most intimate friend. At the same time, Scaliger had made numerous enemies. He hated ignorance, but he hated still more half-learning, and most of all dishonesty in argument or in quotation. Himself the soul of honor and truthfulness, he had no toleration for the disingenuous argument and the misstatements of facts of those who wrote to support a theory or to defend an unsound cause. His pungent sarcasm soon reached the ears of the persons who were its object, and his pen was not less bitter than his tongue. He was conscious of his power, and not always sufficiently cautious or sufficiently gentle in its exercise. Nor was he always right. He trusted much to his memory, which was occasionally treacherous. His emendations, if often valuable, were sometimes absurd. In laying the foundations of his science of ancient chronology, he relied sometimes on groundless or even absurd hypotheses, often based on an imperfect induction of facts. Sometimes he misunderstood the astronomical science of the ancients, sometimes that of Copernicus or Tycho Brahe, and he was no mathematician. Scaliger versus the Jesuits. But his enemies were not merely those whose errors he had exposed and whose hostility he had excited by the violence of his language. The results of his method of historical criticism threatened the Catholic controversialists and the authenticity of many of the documents on which they relied. The Jesuits, who aspired to be the source of all scholarship and criticism, saw the writings and authority of Scaliger as a formidable barrier to their claims. Muret, in the latter part of his life, professed the strictest orthodoxy. Lipsius had been reconciled to the Church of Rome. Isaac Casaubon was supposed to be wavering, but Scaliger was known to be an irreconcilable Protestant, as long as his intellectual supremacy was unquestioned. The Protestants had the advantage in learning and scholarship. His enemies, therefore, aimed, if not to answer his criticism or to disprove his statements, yet to attack him as a man and destroy his reputation. This was no easy task, for his moral character was absolutely spotless. Verni's descent. After several attacks purportedly by the Jesuits, in 1607 a new attempt was made. In 1594, Scaliger had published his Epistola Diviste et Splendor Gentis Scaligeri et J.C. Scaligeri Vita. In 1601, Jasper Scipius, then in the service of the Jesuits, published Scaliger Hyperbolimus, the supposititious Scaliger, a quarto volume of more than 400 pages. The author purports to point out 500 lies in the Epistola Diviste of Scaliger, but the main argument of the book is to show the falsity of his pretensions to be of the family of La Scala and of the narrative of his father's early life. No stronger proof, says Pattison, can be given of the impressions produced by this powerful philippic, dedicated to the defamation of an individual, than it had been the source from which the biography of Scaliger, as it now stands in our biographical collections, has mainly flowed. To Scaliger, the publication of Scaliger Hypobolemus was crushing. Whatever his father Julius had believed, Joseph had never doubted himself to be a prince of Verona, and in his epistola had put forth all that he had heard from his father. He wrote a reply to Scipius entitled Confutatio Fabulae Burdenum. In the opinion of Pattison, as a refutation of Scipius, it is most complete, but there are certainly grounds for dissenting from this judgment. Scaliger purported that Scipius committed more blunders than he corrected, claiming that the book made untruthful allegations, but he did not succeed in adducing any proof either of his father's descent from the La Scala family, or of any of the events narrated by Julius prior to his arrival at Agen. Nor does Scaliger attempt a refutation of the crucial point, namely that William, the last prince of Verona, had no son Nicholas, who would have been the alleged grandfather of Julius. But whether complete or not, the Confutatio had little success. The attack attributed to the Jesuits was successful. Scipius was wont to boast that his book had killed Scaliger. The Confutatio was Scaliger's last work. 5 months after it appeared, on the 21st of January 1609 at 4 a.m, he died at Leiden in the arms of his son Heinsius. In his will, Scaliger bequeathed his renowned collection of manuscripts and books to Leiden University Library. Joseph Scaliger.